What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we're continuing to talk about the new January 2024 data slate update for Warhammer 40k, which came in with a bunch of core rules changes, as well as changes to factions and units in the game, alongside a ton of points changes, and we're going to be talking about the factions that were most impacted by those. Yesterday, I talked about the factions that were the most improved, and today we're going to be talking about the opposite, factions that were the most significantly nerfed. We're going to be going in ascending order, and let's do it. First off, we have Thousand Suns. Now, these guys were actually the recipient of basically no changes to the faction. The faction wasn't really rebalanced at all. Got a little bit of mechanical updates in their index cards, but those were mostly to work alongside new rules within the rules commentary. The faction didn't actually change that much, but they did get a bit of a stealth nerf in that the demonic allies, demonic pact ability for demon armies that allowed them to ally into other chaos armies within the super faction was significantly changed, and now requires you to take demon battle line units if you want to take any non-battle line units. Now, for armies that are using Nurgle units, that's not too bad because you still have access to Nurglings, although they are slightly more expensive than they were. However, for the other factions that aren't focusing on Nurgle Allegiant demon allies, this is a pretty big nerf, and we're going to be talking about this quite a bit as we talk about the other chaos sub-factions, but Thousand Suns, I think, was hit maybe the most hard out of all of them. Thousand Suns usually relied pretty heavily on characters like the Changeling or the Blue Scribes to shore up the faction's overall lack of cheap utility units. They can no longer do that without taking also expensive units of blue or pink horror infantry. So while we may see Thousand Suns armies start to move that way, it does mean that the already expensive Thousand Suns faction is going to have less stuff in the army, which means less Cabal points generated and less efficiency overall. It's not a huge change, but it is an impactful one. Moving on, we have Adepta Sororitas. These ladies were the recipients of a couple minor nerfs. Their most effective anti-armor combo, using the Triumph of St. Catherine alongside a Dialogus to pump multiple automatic 6 miracle dice into super duper strong anti-tank weapons like Meltaguns or Multi-Meltas, has been nerfed a little bit. You now can just perform 2 acts of faith with the unit per phase within range of the Triumph's aura rather than an unlimited number. That still means that you can use the combo, it just probably requires you to use multiple units with multiple Dialogi to get the most out of it. We also saw some points nerfs specifically to the Exorcist, which was an indirect fire platform that Adepta Sororitas were taking fairly commonly, but they also got buffs elsewhere, which is why they are at the bottom of this list. Some of their units, like Paragon Warsuits, did get a points decrease, and some of their other lesser played units also got decreases as well, which generally is going to be good for the faction. Although they are going to be less powerful overall, they did get a couple points back to make that feel a little bit better. Next up, we have Space Marines, and by extension, the Space Marine subfactions, specifically Black Templars. Now, all Space Marines are going to be affected by the changes that we talk about here. Black Templars also had a bunch of their faction-specific units increased in points cost. Crusader Squads, Chaplain Grimaldus, and High Marshal Helbrecht have all been the recipients of those upcharges. And that unfortunately means that the hyper-efficient Black Templars builds that we've been seeing in the past are not going to be quite as efficient as they were. In addition, a lot of Space Marine staples like Inceptor Squads, Aggressors, and Whirlwinds were all also increased in points value. Now, many of these units were very cheap and were some of the strongest utility units in the game, so a points increase to them is definitely expected, but it does hit the Space Marine super faction pretty hard, and while they did get points cuts elsewhere, the units that got points reductions on them are not quite as playable and tend to kind of compete against each other, a symptom of the massive number of datasheets that Space Marines have access to. Now, a faction that has the absolute opposite problem, Leagues of Votann, are next. These guys didn't really get too many changes, just some points hikes, but they did get points hikes to some of their more commonly played units. Units like Enhir Hearthguard, Brokir Thunderkin, and Sagittors all got points increases, and while they weren't huge increases, because the army took these units in such large numbers, not having a ton of datasheets to play with, Votann armies will be significantly smaller moving into the new season. Not much else to say there. You're probably just going to be paying another 100 to 200 points in your Votann army, and that is unfortunate, but it is what it is. Now, I said discussion about Chaos Demons would return, and it does with our next faction, that being World Eaters. World Eaters saw some enormous nerfs kind of out of nowhere. The reign of chaos is maybe over moving on into this new season because a lot of chaos subfactions did get nerfed, and although we did see buffs for factions like demons, a lot of the Chaos Space Marine varieties are not as powerful. World Eaters being one of them, having received points increases to 8 bound as well as all their infantry characters, and massive nerfs to the enhancements in their 1 detachment, including a nerf to the damage output of the Berserker Glaive, as well as the transformation of the Favorite of Khorne enhancement from rerolling all of your Blessing of Khorne dice, if you want to only doing so once per game. We also saw Demon Princes kind of out of the blue get a nerf as well, reducing the power of their invulnerable save aura that they project to infantry. All told, it's a sad day for World Eaters. They were doing pretty well, but were relatively inconsistent and unfortunately just got kind of nuked. Although there may still be some playable archetypes within the faction. Now, sticking on these Chaos Space Marine theme, we'll talk about Death Guard next. Death Guard were kind of hit multiple ways. Not only did they get a nerf to their Biologus Putrefier, one of their most commonly played characters, making its grenade ability only usable once per phase, not allowing you to throw free grenades from multiple Biologus Putrefiers all at once. On top of that, they also got massive nerfs to many of the most commonly played vehicles, as well as Plague Marines, models that most Death Guard armies took in between 20 and 60. While some units did get points decreases, whether or not those units are going to see tons of play is questionable, and unfortunately, Death Guard were probably the faction that used the ally mechanics in 10th edition more than anyone else. Because Death Guard project offensive auras that reduce the stats of enemies near them, they naturally mesh with other Chaos units in their detachment pretty well, and they can even stack multiple debuffs together from Nurgle Chaos Demons. Unfortunately, that means that they are subject to the new Demonic Pact rules, forcing them to take battle line units alongside non-battle line units, although that's not a problem when you have access to Nurglings, which are probably still one of the best battle line units in the game. They're just slightly more expensive, meaning that alongside all the other points hikes that Death Guard have to deal with, they also have to pay more for their demonic allies. On top of that, they also use Brigands out of Chaos Knights, and Brigands also saw a points hike, meaning that many Death Guard lists are paying 50 to 70 points more just for their ally slot. Well, alongside their smattering of points buffs, we did see a nice buff to Mortarian's aura to ignore modifiers, meaning that it does ignore modifiers on weapon characteristics, so effects like damage reduction and armor of contempt are punched through. I don't know if that's enough to really rescue them, and Death Guard, unfortunately, are looking pretty battered after this balance update. And with that, we'll move on to Chaos Space Marines. These guys were top of the game moving on into this balance update, and oh boy, have they paid for it. Chaos Space Marines proper have seen massive points hikes to many of their what were frankly undercosted units. Units like Chosen, Forge Fiends, and Obliterators all got points increases, meaning that the classic Chaos Space Marine list that ran 2 to 3 of each of those is probably paying another 150 to 200 points just for being able to take those units. They also saw tons of mechanical changes. Accursed Cultists, in addition to getting a points hike, also reduced their objective control characteristic to 1, and now respawn only once per round instead of the twice that they did previously. They also saw many changes to the stratagems in their Slaves to Darkness detachment. That included a nerf to Dark Obscuration to make it less effective at protecting your units from ranged attacks. Enemies can target the unit with Dark Obscuration on them within 18 inches rather than the previous 12. In addition, Profane Zeal, the stratagem to give units hit and wound rerolls and full hit and wound rerolls if they were undivided, now has some significant changes. It can now only target undivided units, and while it still grants them reroll once they hit, it no longer grants them full rerolls. They simply get rerolls to wound out of that effect. Previously, it used to mesh very well with Dark Pacts, since you would get extra effects on your critical hits, either lethal or sustained, and Profane Zeal allowed you to roll to try to unlock those critical hits, but you can no longer do that. On top of that, being a Chaos faction that oftentimes relied on Nurglings and other demon allies, Chaos Space Marines are going to be suffering from that Demonic Pact update as well, so they have just been hit multiple ways. Now, to be fair, they were so efficient, and most likely still are. I think Chaos Space Marines are still going to be forced to contend with, but they are certainly not at the top of the game like they were previously. Now, for the last almost 7 months that we have been playing 10th edition Warhammer 40k, Aeldari have been an absolute nightmare for everyone in the community to deal with, and it may be that that nightmare is over because Aeldari have finally been clocked right upside the head by the hammer of nerfs. Aeldari received enormous changes in this data slate update, including huge nerfs to their army rule, having the effectiveness of their fate dice from 12 fate dice used at the beginning of the game to be used over the course of the game down to only 6. Their stratagems have also changed, with Phantasm now moving them only d6 inches rather than the previous up to 7, meaning that it's much less reliable and in some instances can entirely fail to protect the units you're using it on at all, as well as some unit abilities changing. Their big powerhouse melee monster, the Incarn, can now only teleport during the Aeldari player's turn, meaning that it can only be used offensively and cannot be used to react defensively when your opponent kills units in their turn to put the Incarn in a safer spot. Wraithguard saw a little bit of a nerf, only targeting the unit that fired at them with their reactive fire ability. On top of that, Night Spinners now, instead of preventing enemies from advancing, now give them -2 to advance, and both of those units received points hikes as well. This is an absolute smorgasbord of nerfs to the Aeldari faction, but one benefit of Aeldari is that they do have a relatively deep stable, and there probably are going to be some Aeldari builds that are, while not quite as effective as we saw them previously, probably still very playable and relatively strong. Now, while Aeldari saw massive mechanical changes, what they didn't see is huge points changes, only to units like Night Spinners and Wraithguard that you may be seeing in less numbers anyway, since their abilities have been nerfed. You can still fall back on MSU-style armies with multiple aspect warriors and vehicles in order to make use of the battle host detachment rule, and those are still probably perfectly playable. And while I'm not sure if they're going to be at the top of the game, I think there's definitely going to be fairly competitive moving on into the new season. And with that, those are all of the most nerfed armies post-January 2024 data slate. Let me know down in the comment section if you have any factions that you thought I missed. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video, and thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.